just be blessed.
My name is Tamara, and I am an emergency physician in Oregon. I have a story to tell about forgiveness. Several years ago, I was reading my Bible and decided to read all of the verses on forgiveness. Went back to my concordance and decided to just look through each verse and read the verse and find out what it meant to me. As I was doing this, I thought I really should figure out what people I haven't forgiven in my life yet. So I decided to look back chronologically. And the first person that I could think of was a little boy that I knew in second grade. At that time, I lived far away in Minnesota, and I was playing with some friends at the neighborhood playground with this little boy and his friends. And we were teasing back and forth, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." And then we ran off to go play. I was swinging in a swing, and I guess the little boy took my words literally and picked up a rock and threw it at my head. As I was swinging, I was sitting back, and I came up, and a rock struck me right in the forehead. There was blood everywhere, and I was screaming. A neighbor lady came out with a towel and called my parents, and my parents took me to the emergency room to get stitches. There was a lot of rock and dirt in my head that had to be cleaned out. And it was a fairly traumatic experience for an 8-year-old. After that, the wound got infected, and it seemed to, I seemed to have a few issues with it. I never saw that child again. We moved to another state that year, and I didn't ever see him again. So I thought to myself, after reading all the biblical verses on forgiveness, that he's probably the first person that I should forgive. I mean, we were 8 years old in second grade, and I thought, I know I haven't consciously thought about forgiveness, but I think he's the first person that I really should forgive. So I did. I prayed for forgiveness for this child, went on about my day. The next day, I went to work in the emergency room, and I had a family come in who had just been in a car accident. Oftentimes, the police or sheriff will come in to the emergency room to investigate the accident and find out how patients are doing. So one of our local sheriffs came into the emergency room with the patient and the family to find out how the patients were doing and find out what had happened. As I'm talking to the sheriff, I noticed his name badge, and it was a name that looked familiar, but that I hadn't seen in our emergency room before. So I asked him, "Did you ever live in Minnesota?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Did you ever go to Sibley Elementary School in Albert Lea?" And he gave me this questioning look like, "Who are you?" And he said, "Yes, I did." And then by that time, my heart was racing, and I started recognizing what was happening. And I said to him, "Is your name David?" And he looked at me like, "Do I know you?" And by this time, I could not believe what was happening. And I said, do you remember throwing a rock at a little girl in second grade?" And he became shocked, and he said, "Was that you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Were you okay?" I remember that day, and I ran home, and I never told my parents, but I've thought about it my whole life. He said, "Were you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I was okay." And he said, "I'm sorry." And I said back to him, "I forgive you." I could not believe that had just happened to me. 30 years later, I'd never seen this sheriff in our emergency department before, and I had been working here for several years. From a state 30 years ago, no other connection. And the day after I was reading my Bible about forgiveness, he showed up in my emergency room so that I could forgive him. There's no way that that could have happened without God finagling it. To have somebody so far away 30 years before that I'd never seen since, that we had no connection with each other. And the day after I prayed for forgiveness for him, he showed up in the emergency room. God said, "Here, you can forgive him in person." That story to me says that forgiveness is very important. There are several lessons that I learned from this event. One of them is obviously the lesson in forgiveness. God wants us to forgive. I have learned through the years that forgiveness is not a feeling. Forgiveness is a choice. And even when you don't feel like forgiving somebody when they've harmed you deeply, which was not the case in the situation, but even when somebody's harmed you dearly, that God asks you to forgive that person just as he's forgiven you. And it's not because you feel like forgiving them. You may still be angry. You may still be very hurt by the incident, but you can choose to say, "God, I trust you. I'm going to forgive this person." The second one is that God's limit knows no bounds. He can create a miracle right in front of your eyes. I can't imagine that this was ever just a coincidence. It was a miracle. I know God's hand was in this. We need to be able to trust God, to know that even though you may not think that he's working behind the scenes, years after year after year, you pray to him. You become his friend. He takes care of you. He speaks to you. And he always has your best good in mind. So that even though while you're praying every day, you may not see the outcome of that prayer, 30 years down the line, that prayer will be answered because God is always faithful. So I think there were several lessons to learn from this particular event. And I think it was one of the biggest stories that has ever happened to me, and a story in which God showed me that he exists and that little things and my little life is important to him. And so is yours. When we think about forgiveness, we think about that when we forgive somebody, that we're blessing somebody else. But in reality, forgiveness brings a peace, the removal of a burden off of our shoulder, which tends to be even a bigger blessing to us. It's not just about the other person. Forgiveness is for yourself. It's a gift from God. We can't muster up the forgiveness. We can't make ourselves feel forgiving. Forgiveness is a choice, and in that choice, when we are doing what the Lord asks us to do, he blesses us tremendously.